My name is Erica Donnison, and I'm part of the Alexander Studies Online team. And this month, we're continuing where we left off in the conversation that I had with Tim Cacciatore last month, where we're talking about his recently published paper together with Rajal Cohen and David Anderson. And the paper is called Central Mechanisms of Muscle Tone Regulation, Implications for Pain and Performance. And this month, we're going to be exploring how the contents of the paper relate more to some of the terms that we use in our Alexander teaching. So, my first question is, you talk about central control of muscle tone, and what immediately jumped out at me was, how does this relate to what we as Alexander teachers might call the primary control?
So the central control of tone, as a refresher, are the control of tone that's from the brain downward, as opposed to being driven by sensory input, like reflexes, right? So it's the part that can be influenced through thoughts and attention and so forth. So then on the other hand, we get to the point of primary control. So what do we mean by primary control? So I mean, of course, Alexander talked about it as a certain relativity or relationship between the head and neck and the spine that influenced lots of stuff, both sort of motor things, but also the whole organism, right? Psychological things or whatnot. And I don't think that's unreasonable. But, when you go and try to put your finger on it, a certain relativity is not a sort of an operationally defined term, meaning you can't measure that, right? What does that mean? Is it an angle? No, it's not an angle. It may relate to an angle. People have, put their heads do go sort of back and down. We call that head forward posture, but that's not really it. That's related. Um, I mean, some people even talk about it in the opposite way, like Chris Stevens, who talked about the head neck as an indicator of what's happening elsewhere. So I think more broadly, it makes sense to think about it as some sort of complicated control. There's an interaction about control that happens that's related to the head and neck, it's related to the spine, and it's related to other places as well. I don't think it's related to the rest of the body. And in our course, we asked with Patrick Johnson, we asked people what the primary control was, and there's kind of a range of different ways people think about it. So it's not a completely precisely defined thing even amongst Alexander teachers. So I thought the best thing to do might be for me to talk about what I think of as primary control, and I can then relate that.
Yes, that'd be good.
So for me, when I'm either working on myself or working on someone else, that there's this state that I get to. I guess I'm describing the primary control working well. There's a state that I get to where you can. It's almost like the organization of the spine somehow feels dominant. Things are very released, and there's a very clear connection along the spine, and and that's interrelated with the limbs in some adaptive way. There's a real adaptability to the system. There's kind of a springiness to it, but as opposed to like these other patterns of tension that are kind of driving what's happening, that the spine is kind of manifest, right? And there's kind of a pattern to it. There's similar things that happen across people. I think of it um, as a control, meaning a control over tone that relates very much to the spine, how the spine is organized and controlled, but also, how the head and neck affect the spine, but also how other things affect it, right? And vice versa. So it's kind of like this web with the head and neck being a strong influence, but really, to me, when it's working well, it's almost like the head and neck is out of the way and the spine is really organized and it's sort of relating well to the rest of the body. So that, for me, that's the phenomenon that I will then try to describe what might be the neuroscience of, right? Because we don't really know, but somehow somehow um, that activity is regulated.
Mm,
And from the paper that there are different types of regulation. We talk heavily about central regulation,
mm,
which means basically from the brain, as opposed to from like stretch receptors or from sensory input.
mm,
So, you might, the Magnus reactions where you tilt a head and you get changes in tone in the limbs. In a way, that's sensory driven
mm,
because it's how the inner ear and the neck receptors and they basically project to the brainstem and then the brainstem projects to the spinal cord. So it's like the sensory input that's impinging on then at that point it's central. Once the sensory comes in, there's central aspect. So it's hard to tease those things apart.
mm,
Does it have a central aspect? Absolutely, right?
mm.
The control over tone definitely goes through the brainstem. Without the brainstem, there's no tone, and there's sort of a complexity of different pathways that regulate it. So a lot more is known about the how tone is regulated in the limbs than it is in the body axis.
Mm.
But for the limbs, it's clear these spinal circuits that are regulating the amount of tone based on how much weight you're carrying or what the position is and so forth. They uh, are organized in terms of, and this was done in quadruped in four-legged animals, and they're organized where the hind both back legs kind of are controlled by like a unit in the nervous system that gets information from both legs and integrates that and then figures out, well, how much tone does each leg need, and then there's separate controller for the front legs,
Mm.
right? And so for the spine, the question is the body axis. The question is, well, how there are many muscles that are, tone is distributed across the spine. How is the amount of tone determined, right? Somewhere, somewhere there's a process that influences that,
Yeah,
and
must.
a lot of that is central. It's not exclusively, right? Peripheral feedback, sensory input is relevant to that too. It could be that nice interconnection that one feels is due to essentially this circuit talking more directly with this circuit
Mm,
as opposed to shoulder tension or something getting in the way, but somehow this circuit is more prominent. But does it also have a sensory input? So is it so what if your head gets all jammed up and your limbs aren't working well, or your spine is stuck as a result? Is that happening through sensory pathways? Like, is it that our spine is jammed up and that's affecting, stretch receptors in the neck or something that are then feeding into this circuit that controls the distribution of tone in the spine and other psychological factors even, right?
mm.
But is that because there's sensory input that's coming in? Or is that because, the thing that's controlling the neck is also talking to the spine, right? Right. So there could be things that aren't dependent on sensory input that talk to each other.
Yeah,
It's probably
yeah,
all
yeah.
of the above, right? I mean, things are
Mm,
things are very complicated. And it doesn't just go one way. Like in Twister, if you twist somebody's hips and they're blindfolded, the neck will twist the other way. So there's interactions that happen all across the body.
mm,
But I think what's key about primary control is that there's this organization that we're looking for. some organization of the spine and the way that interrelates to the head and the limbs, and that it influences, state of mind. Head and neck are somehow a significant influence.
Okay, yeah, I get it's really complicated.
So it's really complicated, but there's no question that it will involve central aspects of the nervous system that are controlling. It's not just going to be some peripheral reflex thing.
Yeah,
That's just not how it works. We,
yeah,
we wouldn't be able to influence it with our thinking if it just was some
yeah.
some peripheral feedback loop. Yeah.
And obviously, back in FM Alexander's day, he had no idea about all of the stuff that you're talking about in the paper. And he must have got a sense that there was something that was controlling, which I think was perhaps why he was a bit cagey about what he called it and found it so difficult to describe. And yeah, so I guess that's always been the problem.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's actually a fascinating history here that John Fisher wrote a paper about. He's talked about it for some time now, and there's a really interesting history there because Alexander knew about Magnus, and there's this paper that was published, and Alexander actually had the journal with that paper in it in his possession, and he talked about it. It was equated the sort of neck reflexes that Magnus was talking about. Magnus actually called it, I think, central apparat, which is central control. And, I can't remember if it was Alexander or if it was other people around him. I think there was a lot of sloppiness that basically people were just saying, oh, it's that. It's that thing that he discovered over
Yeah.
there that everybody's excited about. That's what we're doing. And it had some parallels, right? It had
Mm,
the head neck influence on the rest of the body. So it makes sense. But they were a bit too liberal, and they got caught out in the libel case, right? That was a thing in the libel case that they had to retract um, because the scientists argued that this couldn't be the same thing. This was in decerebrate animals and blah 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 blah. And yeah, I don't think that. I mean, basically, what Magnus was talking about is you change the attitude of the neck, and that basically, that projects to brainstem pathways that then project to the spinal cord, and that then changes limbs. It changes tone in the limbs, and
mm.
in decerebrate animals, it's very robotic. It's like you change the head and position, and then the limbs move.
Right.
Yeah. So is that what we're doing? Are we just moving the angle of the head? No, no, it's much more complicated than that, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like, oh, you want a little more primary control,
Yeah.
turn the head a little bit more. It's not like that at
Yeah.
all. There are these subtle shifts in patterns of tension
Mm.
that wind up somehow interacting with, again, the regulation of tone and other things that affect it more globally.
Mm. So perhaps we can say more work to be done on
Yeah,
on picking some of this.
for sure, for sure. But I think
That's always the
we can
thing.
kind of put a little box around it to kind of talk about it a little bit more. But yes, there's a lot more to be figured out there. But
Mm. Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. And I think perhaps we can be quite free with our use of these things. Um, as teachers kind of go, oh yeah, well, let's get your primary control working, and we don't really know what we're talking about. When-
right, but it's a shorthand for an observation that it
Yeah,
probably happens because of a complex underlying
yeah. I mean, there's
phenomenon.
something there that we can see or feel, or
Yeah.
and yeah, and actually the mechanism for understanding it is
It,
complex, and
it,
yeah,
it, it,
more
it,
to be done. But
yeah.
there's definitely something. So yeah, we're not wrong.
Right.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so my next question is that you mentioned postural plasticity, and you also talk about habits. So can you can you just talk a bit about that? What you mean by postural plasticity with respect to what we might talk about as habitual tension or habits?
Sure. So
Sorry.
there's different levels, okay, on which things can. So plasticity refers to adaptation, and
Yeah.
there's different ways in which things can be adaptive. And the guy, the researcher Victor that I worked with, came up with this idea. He was working with the Mir space station, 70s or whatnot, 70s, 80s. And they found they did experiments about what happened to cosmonauts, when they went up into space immediately and then over long periods of time. And immediately there's a shift. Like right away, the second you go into zero G, there's a shift.
Mm.
But then over the course of months, there are more shifts. So meaning that if you strap people's feet down when they're in space and you blindfold them and you just have them assume whatever posture, that posture starts to shift, right? Immediately it goes to something very strange, and then after months it sort of comes back to something that looks, more like what you see on Earth. So there are these two processes of adaptation. There's one that's happening right away, that's adapting for things in the moment, and then there's this kind of long-term sort of conserved state. And when we talk about habits, we're talking about that conserved
Mm.
state generally, right? There's someone that's been hiking their right shoulder up for years, and it is very intransigent. It doesn't want to change.
Got stuck.
It got stuck. So on one level, the postural system is very sensitive to change. On another level, it has its strong habitual preferences.
Right.
Yeah. And so plasticity, you can refer to both of those, and it's not like they're completely independent. If someone is like really stuck and holding a lot of tension, they're not going to be able to adapt well in the moment either.
Hmm.
Yeah, so we try to shift those long-term postural habits, but we also do kind of shorter term things to see how adaptive someone is in that moment.
Yeah, my next question is around how muscle tone affects our ability to stay in balance. Because, and again, we talk about balance a lot in the Alexander technique. And yeah, we would perhaps talk about, postural tone or whatever as being important in that. So, but how does, the words in your paper, how does that relate to staying in balance?
Sure. Well, balance basically relates to not toppling over at if you're if you're standing, right? Which is different from the postural support that
Yes,
goes
yes.
through your body. You can have good postural support, like a young infant, right? Can have very good postural support, but they can't balance on their
Oh, okay. Yes, I see what you
right
mean.
there. Um, so there are a number there are a number of different studies that suggest that postural tone does affect balance, and probably, if for no other reason, through just the overall stiffness of the system.
Hmm.
Because if the system is very stiff, it's hard to move, it's hard to articulate, uh, um, and it limits the options and affects the ability to balance.
Hmm. So I guess, my thought now is around how that manifests itself in perhaps older people with the fear of falling work that's been done, and also in Parkinson's, where there's a stiffness
Yeah,
effect to that, and
absolutely.
the
Yeah,
falls is one of the
yeah.
symptoms that happens. So yeah, that sounds sensible in that respect.
Yeah, yeah. And so if phrased a different way, the question would be like if you have someone, say, with Parkinson's who's extremely rigid,
Yeah.
and then say you put them on the table and whatnot, and you get them to soften up maybe over a period of a number of sessions, how would that change affect their
Mm.
balance? And it probably we think it would anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a bit in your paper about how afferent input, as you put it, which is, I looked it up,
Yeah.
something coming in from the outside.
Sensory input. Yeah.
Sensory input.
Coming in as opposed to going
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so that influences tone, which again, we know this.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to see that in the paper in black and white. So I don't know whether there's something you can say around that to enlarge on what you were saying in the paper.
Yeah, well, there are likely many different pathways. I mean, I think that's one of the big take homes is that the tone system isn't like an on-off switch. It's not like a yes/no thing. It's there are many different pathways that can be influenced in different ways. So it's almost like a palette of someone's organization has many different
Hmm.
aspects to it, and so different types of sensory stimulation likely influence the tone system in different ways. For instance, massage, right? No doubt it changes tone,
Hmm.
but it probably changes tone in a different way from the sort of lighter Alexander touch, and it's probably acting through different circuits. Light light touch can affect tone, massage, vibration, sound can even affect tone.
Right.
Um, so
Well, yes.
there's a whole range of sensory stimulation that is relevant.
Right. Okay. Again, that would be an interesting thing to look at, wouldn't it? Because as
Mm,
the intention behind it within Alexander work.
yeah.
I mean, that clearly is, I guess, the case in massage, but in a very different way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would be difficult, but interesting to
Yeah.
explore. Again, some terms that you use, which is anticipatory muscle adjustment. I just love the language. I just it really get into words like this. That to me immediately made me think of FM doing his oh well, I only had to think about reciting to make my neck pull back and down.
Yeah.
Is that what that means, anticipatory muscle adjustments, or not so much?
It's a good question. Kind of, yes. So if you go to say open a door or you go to move your arm and you make any sort of even tap your finger, the muscle that is active first isn't the one that's moving the finger. It isn't the one that's moving your arm. There are other muscles that your brain is activating to kind of stabilize the body. It knows, and even with your finger, it's like your finger pulls on your wrist, which pulls on your forearm, and so forth. And so you have stabilization activity that goes all the way up into your back before your arm moves to compensate for those destabilizations. So that's sort of anticipatory postural
Right.
adjustments, and so in the Alexander technique, we also there's this preparation that happens in advance before movement. Or before, yeah, just the thought of doing an action or something, someone can sort of tense. And I think it's not clear, both are preparatory. It's not clear if they're the same circuits that are doing that. It's possible, but we don't know, and I mean it's certainly something that's worth looking into. And I mean there is anticipatory activity in the neck. Ian Lorem has done some nice work with that, and those are activity that comes on before performing an activity in the neck. So it could be extremely related.
Mm. I mean, what you
Mm.
described first was is more or less the body wanting to stay in balance, isn't it? Because if you're going to pick something up, or
Yeah,
even the finger, it shifts
right.
where you are in space, and so your body goes, "Oh, okay. So if I'm going to do that, then I need to sort this out first."
Exactly. It's
What you're
it's
talking
almost
about?
like it's built into the motor program,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah. So whether that's tone or not tone, I think is the question. And for teachers, it probably doesn't matter, but I think it's a very interesting question. Is that the same system? And it could be that, if tone is disorganized, it's requiring, extra compensatory tightening, or it tends to produce extra compensatory tightening kind of beforehand.
Mm.
Or it could be that tightening is the brain actually switching up tone before the action. Uh, um, it's unclear, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, an example I often use with when I'm working with people is that if you're going to pick something up and you think it's heavy, but it's actually turned out to be
Yes.
polystyrene, and you kind of go
Yeah.
because you've done
Yeah.
so much effort, or
Right.
the other way around, that you think it's
Exactly.
polystyrene and it's actually something really
Yes.
heavy, and you can't do
Yeah.
it. So your body's prepared for the wrong thing, in
Yes.
effect, because it thought it was
That's
one thing, or I thought it was one thing, and then it wasn't. So
Exactly.
yeah, so that
Yeah.
sounds like the same sort of
Yeah.
pathway. You can get it wrong.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so the last question I was going to ask you about this is the again, it's a bit in the paper where you talk about the process where interruption of communication between brainstem and spinal cord abolishes muscle tone and postural responses. So again, I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just sounds so discuss.
Sure. Well, I mean, if someone has a spinal cord injury, for instance, right, that is different from someone who has a stroke. So in spinal cord injury, you tend to get so you're disrupting that pathway,
Hmm,
and you tend to get a lack of tone, right? Things are just not activated.
hmm,
Right, they're extremely floppy and flaccid. The tone goes way down because those pathways from the brainstem to the spinal cord that's giving it that excitability are disrupted. But there are other pathways that higher up that if they're disrupted, they wind up having the opposite effect, and you can get sort of spasticity.
hmm,
And that's because um, as opposed to sort of disconnecting the spinal cord from the brainstem, it winds up actually increasing the amount of drive from the brainstem or decreasing the amount of drive, and then the spinal cord adapts to get more excitable. Basically, it's complicated. There's a lot that's going on there, but these descending pathways are really important.
You're right. Okay, so you're
Mhm.
talking about the interruption of communication is actually something quite drastic as opposed
Yeah,
to a postural habit.
yeah.
Yeah,
The
okay.
interruption is extremely
Yeah,
drastic. Yeah,
yeah. So yeah, because I think when I read it, I thought you might have meant, something like well, forward head posture where you're kind of in effect kind of what's the word I'm trying to say? You're just by being in a particular position,
hmm
if you like, could block the communication. Because in my experience, I think that's kind of is what happens, if you like. So if you're sort of sitting there with your head forward here, nothing seems to work. That the pathway, primary control doesn't work.
Right. I would think that that's happening for other reasons. I don't think that if the circuits, if your this communication in the spinal cord was shut off, you wouldn't be able to move your legs. Uh,
Yes,
um,
yes, quite.
you wouldn't be able to. So I think that's happening for other reasons and a complete blockage of that
Yeah.
pathway. But in a way these descending central pathways are things that we're probably tuning. Especially within the Alexander technique, we're increasing tone here and some releasing here, organizing in this way. It probably has a lot to do with these descending pathways, and of course how they interact with. Uh, um, we have to we probably interact with them through the cortex, right? Through
Mm,
higher our attention and intention, sometimes imagery. Uh, um,
right. Yeah, I might have missed something, so I don't know whether there's anything else that you think would be interesting that kind of relates to Alexander speak, as it were, from what's in the paper.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the things that we tried to do is we tried to look across a range of different somatic disciplines and just try to pick out some commonalities and that the argument that we're trying to make is that we're working with this involuntary system and that things like non-doing in a way are a way of doing that and attention and whatnot is a way of working with this involuntary system.
Hmm.
Yeah, the paper is trying to kind of make that general point.
So, brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your time, Tim, over this month and last month. We'll also maybe put your email address, so if anyone's got any questions,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
they get to you through.
My email address is on the paper actually.
Oh, right.
So
Okay. Yes, of course. Yeah. So any questions they can address to you. But obviously we have the comments section on the ASO page as well. So anything you want to say, you can put on there. So yeah, thank you ever so much again, and no doubt, hopefully, we'll speak to you again when you do something something interesting next time.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Thanks for having me.